Liberated Africans as Agents of Slave Trade Suppression, a collective biography of African soldiers in the British naval post at Havana, 1837-1843.
The technology for 2 seconds. If y'all can see that, that makes me happy. I would thank, Alex for his organization and Henry for the brilliant transition to my paper, even though we were a panel that wasn't supposed to be together. Because we couldn't have written it better, because what this paper is about is actually how Cubans, both black and non-black, in Havana perceive liberated African presence in different ways. And my paper is very much about transient liberated Africans that were characterized as black British, but in working on other things, I realized that they were not black British at all, that they were emancipados who in some cases left Havana, gone to British territories, and then came back as soldiers. And this raises all kinds of questions about how liberated African identities of various sorts are perceived. Like a lot of panels, we've gone from a data set of 3,000 odd Lupumi down to a sort of micro-history that's got at best 150 so-called black British soldiers who are mostly liberated Africans in it. That's the sort of introduction to the paper. I do want to thank, as many people have, David Eltis and the people who've worked on this project forever. I still remember vividly, although I suspect David has forgotten because he's nurtured so many scholars in this work, the first conversation I had with him in, I think, 1991 about the Havana registers. We were in the then not so fancy tea room at the National Archives in the UK, and it was an incredible thing. I was like, this stuff is amazing. And there's also in this room, and I want to sort of, so many people have been so generous with me, Ugo in the conference in 2008, Andy Pearson, who I think I rang him up, I had about 36 hours before I left England and demanded to see the St. Helena record. And he obliged. What I want to talk about today, and I think I will do more reading than many people, because I'm told that if I don't read, I speak way too quickly. I'm in the middle of 3 projects, one of which is a microhistory of a single slave ship that has to do with a case that was pursued by the British consul David Turnbull. And that's actually the start of all the other projects. The other is the microhistory that is the subject of my paper, trying to figure out the social history of black and, as I've just recently found out, liberated African life aboard this British ship that's often on the edges of slave trade suppression stories. It's like, oh yes, it's the British ship in the harbor. The fact that it's mostly staffed by liberated Africans. And I'm trying to sort of look at their social world. And then a lot of what I'm doing with both of those microhistories talks to some things that Daryl brought up yesterday, that I really do believe that these liberated Africans, however small their numbers, and even in tiny microhistories, in both cases of less than 300 people, that they can tell us a lot about the contours of black freedom in certain kinds of places in the Americas. The project that's larger and fits better, I think, with this workshop is that out of stumbling onto these liberated Africans aboard that ship, what I've been trying to do is work on a kind of bigger social history of liberated Africans within the British West India regiments, because we talk about the fact that they are enlisted, and they get into these regiments that pre-exist, have Caribbean-born and African-born troops, and they become an interesting population within that. Today I want to talk specifically about the ones who ended up at Havana, but the larger project tries to go through thousands of them that end up in these regiments, and what does that mean? The origins of this comes through, in one of my microhistories, I'm working with, it's a case involving violence against Africans aboard the slave ship Jesus Maria. And one of the things that I came across, I started tracking the interpreter. And for those of you that know Havana in this period, the abolitionist British consul David Turnbull is a bad diplomat. And he gets obsessed with the fact that he's found a perfect interpreter among the West India Regiment. and that there are other Ganga speakers, and this is a sort of Upper Guinea Coast Ganga, and he's convinced you can't, he's asking the regiment, you can't move these soldiers, because this person, George Elder, is the perfect interpreter. And so I started tracking him, and that's how I got to the data that I'm now working with, and I realized that what's aboard this ship is not really black British troops at all, but in fact, other liberated Africans. What am I doing? Shall I just use the arrow? I'm glad someone else did this before me. What I'm talking about is a ship, what's in the right foreground is a comparable vessel to what the HMS Romney was, stationed at Havana. So in June of 1840, which is really the middle piece of my story, a local Havana official complained to the Captain General about having encountered 5, quote, blacks in military uniform belonging to the English ship passing through his village in a wanton and arrogant manner. 3 years earlier, during the summer of 1837, less colorful correspondence moved back and forth between about a half dozen British government offices concerning the question of how to staff a proposed, quote, receiving ship that was to be sent to Havana, Cuba, as a part of Great Britain's efforts to suppress the continuing Atlantic slave trade. The plan to station a naval vessel permanently in Havana came in the wake of a second anti-slave trade treaty between Great Britain and Spain, signed in 1835, designed to strengthen a previous similar treaty in 1817. The proposal to station a vessel in Havana also formed part of newly developing plans, and this becomes critical to my story, to transfer most Africans rescued from illegally operating slave ships out of Cuba into Britain's own Caribbean colonies. As a part of the treaty arrangements, the two nations operated this mixed commission court, known to most people in this room. Court rulings overwhelmingly found suspected vessels to have violated Anglo-Spanish treaties and resulted in the immediate emancipation of Africans found aboard. Britain's use of liberated Africans in our own so-called free Caribbean colonies faced significant and often justified criticism. Specifically, as many people have touched on, the liberated Africans that ended up, whether in Sierra Leone or in the British Caribbean, in a state of virtual slavery. That history and its controversies about who liberated Africans were, however, happened outside of sort of Cuba and in British colonies. For almost a decade, though, in the Havana harbor, the HMS Romney selected as its sort of military population liberated Africans who, in effect, remained in Cuba. By any conventional measures, the decade which the Romney spent as a depot ship at Havana counts as a very small piece of the history of slavery and emancipation in the Caribbean, and even as a small piece of the story of slave state suppression. In what remains the canonical English text and English language on the illegal slave trade, David Murray argues that by the autumn of 1839, British commissioners in Havana had decided that the Romney in general and its crew were far more a nuisance than they were worth. The permanent presence of a foreign military vessel in the Havana harbor by itself represented to some degree an affront to Spanish sovereignty. Still, a disproportionate share of Cuban complaints about the Romney focused not on these larger concerns about the ship itself, but specifically on the relationship between the black people aboard this British vessel and black people, both free and enslaved, in the city of Havana. People of African descent of various backgrounds stayed for both short and long periods aboard the Romney during its Havana posting, which lasted from spring 1837 until 1846. But the most constant, most consequential black population aboard the vessel consisted of between 20 and 30 free black soldiers from the 1st and 2nd West India regiments, who served as the main force of enlisted men doing the day-to-day work and standing ready to serve as potential guards or supervisors for any liberated Africans who might be brought aboard. That's one of those, for those of you who do any sort of, the standard picture of sort of slave trade controversies or ships being seized in the Havana harbor, and not a 2nd West India, but roughly a comparable era picture of West India regiments. Despite the fact that by 1837 the British had maintained black West India regiments in the Caribbean for more than half a century, and black troops had served in various capacities throughout the Americas, the very idea of bringing free black British soldiers to Cuba provoked protest and pleading from Cuban authorities from the start. The Spanish government unsuccessfully requested the use of white soldiers, considering the free black man a potential disruptive force in Cuban slave society. This is a big discussion not for this venue, because there is something that gets to Henry's point. It's their blackness, their Britishness, and I would argue from this paper